Hello everyone and welcome to this online recording which today covers sampling. Now sampling is part of the research methods section in your research project, and I wouldn't worry too much about it. It's mainly for very advanced projects and projects that want to do very well. You haven't got to do a major amount on sampling, but you do have to consider it and consider the different methods and ultimately select a method of sampling. So today we're going to look at what sampling is, to give you some guidance and some insight into the different techniques in sampling, and then we'll look at a whole range of techniques of sampling, and then we'll also look at, which you've looked briefly in the past, about case study research and those people that might be considering case study research, because case study research is actually a sampling method, and we'll consider that later in this recording. So what is sampling? Well, before we look at sampling, we probably need to look at what a population is. And remember that all of you who are listening to this will be doing a research project. At some point you'll need to think, who am I researching? Who am I asking questions to? Who am I observing? Or who are the people I am actually researching here? Or what am I researching? And whatever you're researching, there will be a population. These are basically all the cases within the research. So it's nicely shown through this diagram. So if you think about you're researching consumers who buy Apple iPhones, well, there's probably some figures out there to suggest that millions of people buy Apple iPhones. Everyone who buys an Apple iPhone is part of the population. One individual who buys an Apple iPhone is a case, or sometimes they're called an element, but generally they're called a case. So one person who buys an Apple iPhone is a case. Everyone who buys an Apple iPhone is the population, and a sample is just a small number of those cases, a representative number of those cases that are part of the population. So you can see there, it's just a very small represented sample, or a small number of cases or people that are part of the population, and they're the part of the people that you're going to research. So basically in your research project, you at some stage, especially in the methodology, need to define what the population is. So, all customers who use a supermarket. Is it all customers who use Asda in Moss Side, Manchester? Or is it all Asda supermarket customers across the UK? Or is it all supermarket customers for Tesco's within every country that they're trading? So you've got to define what the whole population is. Other examples of defining the population are all employees who work at a university, so all employees that work for Pearson College, for example, or it could be all students who buy from Just Eat. So that would be the population. You've defined them. So it's very important that you clearly define the population to start with. Then you can start thinking about, right, it's not possible to ask questions to all the population or to observe all the population. It's not possible to do that, but it is possible to take a very small sample, a few of the people in that population, and look at them and ask them questions or observe them, whatever research methods you're using. It's viable to do that. So before we move on into the different sampling techniques you may want to try and select, spend 5 to 10 minutes just thinking about defining your population. Who are the people you're actually trying to research and survey or question, or whatever you're going to do with them in terms of research method? Who's the important population? You may have two populations, so don't think you've just got one. You may have employees at Starbucks, and then you may have customers of Starbucks. Now that's particularly useful if you're using looking at two perspectives. Some of your research, especially at level 6, and I know this recording is for level 4, your first year, second year, and final year, but you may be having more of a sophisticated project at level 6, where you're looking at a research project which looks at different perspectives, an employee perspective and a customer's perspective. Obviously, then you would have two populations, which you then need to sample from each. So what I want you to do is pause for a moment, just think about 5 to 10 minutes of trying to define who your population is for the research, and think about the research problem, opportunity to issue. Who are you going to research and how would you describe them? Pause the recording now, spend some time doing this, and then we'll move on. Good. Well, okay, we've looked at a population, but now we need to look at sampling. It is, and the reason why we sample is fairly obvious, really. But it's for a start, it's impractical to survey the entire population. If you imagine you were doing research into the customers at Tesco, you define the population of all customers who shop at Tesco in the UK. Well, that would be into the millions. And it's just impossible to actually survey that many people, especially on your own for an individual project. Some of you might be doing this in groups as part of your unit specification. And that does depend on which unit you're on at Pearson College. But generally, it's very impractical, very costly to survey the entire population. The only real surveys that kind of do that are the census, where it is actually it's mandatory by law that you have to fill in a census every 10 years. But it takes them 10 years to process all the results. So you can tell it's a really costly and really lengthy exercise, and we don't have time for that. We need to consider sampling quite strongly. We also might have budget constraints. Imagine doing a questionnaire, printing out millions and millions of questionnaires. It's really costly. So sometimes we just can't do that. We don't have the budget. We have time constraints. Surveying a whole population it just takes so much time. Even millions of customers at Tesco, it's just taking ages. And even if you had really powerful servers and computers and you did online surveying, it would still take a long time. And they do have the money and cash to do it, and they do attempt to do it. But for us as individuals, we just can't do it. So we have to be realistic. And of course, we might need the results quickly. We might have an urgent question that we need to consider, and we need to look at it very quickly, and we just need to get some data to make some decisions. So generally, most of us who are listening to this are basically in the position where it's impractical to survey, it's a budget constraint, and it's a time constraint to survey the entire population. So we are going to be forced into a situation of sampling. Now, in terms of the sample size, it's very difficult to give you advice on this because generally the advice is the larger the better. Because what we're trying to do, the bigger the sample, the more representative it will be of the entire population. Now, that's really important because you may have come across this word before. I've mentioned it in other recordings, but also you may have come across it in your own readings of any good research methods textbook. But there's this term called generalizability. When you come to the end of your research project, you'll be discussing the results of your actual research. You'll be working out what it means and what those findings actually mean, or what that data means. But then you've got to question, does these findings apply to everywhere, every business or every industry? Or does it just apply to where I've been researching? Does it just appear to apply to that company? What we tend to aim as researchers is we try to conduct an investigation, get some data, get some research, do some research, and we try to understand the results of those findings. And those results, we try to make them generalizable. In other words, that they fit most situations. It is very difficult, and many of you will probably pose limitations, saying, well, actually, this is only applicable to this healthcare sector because the research wasn't conducted in any other sector. So it's very difficult to have a wholly generalizable theory or findings to any research project because we have to research in a very small setting. But that's just one of the limitations. But the bigger the sample, the better, really, because it gives us better results, more representative results. If we have a small sample, there's more chances of bias creeping in. Now, it also does depend, the size of the sample does depend on previous research. So remember, you've been looking at previous research as part of your literature review. You've been looking at other people doing questionnaires, interviews, whatever they may be doing. They'll give some figures of how many interviews, how many questionnaires, whatever it was. If they've done a questionnaire of 500, then ideally, and this is for very much more for advanced levels, level 6, ideally you want to actually be trying to push that a bit further. You want to try to have a little bit of a bigger sample. In my own research career, when I was doing some research, I was finding that one of the latest research papers surveyed 64 companies. Fine. Well, I managed to survey 124 companies. So I just about doubled it. So I made a contribution. Now remember, this is another key word: contribution. When you're looking at your research and you're doing your research and you're getting your findings, what you're trying to work out is, what do my findings say differently to the existing findings or the existing literature? And that's why the literature review is really important, because you're looking at what everyone else is saying and what the current state of play is with the research, and you're trying to make a contribution. You're not trying to make groundbreaking contribution, a groundbreaking difference to the topic, but you're trying to say, well, actually, this research has found something slightly different or something slightly more than previous research, and that's what a contribution is. I mean, that's the, I don't think you have to be Einstein here, but it's about making a slight contribution, and that's why looking at the previous research and understanding how many they've surveyed will give you an idea of how much your sample size should be. When you are writing this in your research method section or chapter of your research project, it's important to state the number. So what's the estimated numbers in the sample? Can you back that up with any referencing? I'm sure there'll be some figures out there. If you were surveying customers at Tesco about something, then there will be some figures how many people shop at Tesco's every week. How big's the sample? How big is the population? Reference it. How big is your sample in the end? So remember to state the numbers, very important, so you can see the extent you've been working to. Now, we're going to look at different sampling techniques that you could select. Now, the important thing is not to get too hung up about this, okay? It's not a major thing. All you've got to do is look at how you've been choosing the people to survey or interview or whatever you've been doing, and relate it to one of these sampling methods. And there is far more. This is a quite comprehensive list, but there's other ones you can read about. So my recommendation is stick to what we've got here, but do some more reading in the sampling, any sampling chapter of any good research methods book. So we'll go through these now, and let's see which ones may be more appropriate to your own research. So the first one we're looking at is cluster sampling. Now, this is very straightforward. So we've got a population, we've defined the population, and we divide that population into groups or clusters, okay? And the way we decide on what the groups will be would be based on some naturally occurring variable within the population. So, for example, we may have a group of people and we divide them into two groups, male and female. Or we may divide it by postcode, geographics. We may have a list of companies. We divide them by SIC codes, standard industry classifications. So plastic companies, computer manufacturers, IT consultancy companies, we divide them by their type of company they are, and we put them into these groups, and these groups are called clusters. And then a number of clusters are selected at random. So we put these things in a hat. We pick out 3 or so clusters, and that's the ones we pick that are randomly selected with no bias there. Remember, that's really important here. And then data is collected from every case within the selected sample. So every cluster may have 10 companies in, or 5 companies in, or whatever it may be. Once we pick these clusters at random, we just go and survey all the companies in that cluster. Now, one of the disadvantages of this, it does depend on how many companies or how many people are in each cluster. So if you've got 100 companies in one cluster and that gets picked out the hat, you've got to survey all those 100. So that's a bit problematic. So just be careful there that the clusters are fairly small to start with, and you put them in a hat. You pick out the clusters and you go for it. So you're just basically picking groups of companies or groups of individuals, and then going to survey all those individuals that have been picked. Convenience sampling. Now, this involves selecting those cases that are easiest to obtain data from. So this is people who volunteer. So if you're doing an online survey, for example, generally people will ignore it and not do it, or they'll select themselves and say, yeah, I'll do this, and I'll put down some details and my answers to my questions. So convenience sampling is basically people who volunteer to take part in your research. Obviously, the big problem with this, and you can note this in your limitations of your research methods, is that it's prone to bias, because if people have something they're quite strongly opinionated, they want to say something, want to get this down, then obviously they're going to put their name forward. They're going to put this down in your research. So, it can be prone to bias, and therefore, it can have non-representative um, cases from your population. So just got to be wary of that in when we're talking about our results. Um, it does provide simple results, but again, not representative of the population, and not a problem to go for this one, but just be aware of the limitations. Simple random sampling. Okay, now this involves selecting a sample at random, completely random. So uh, imagine you have a list of people that you are thinking about surveying. You're looking at students at Pearson College, for example. Let's say there's 100 students. So each student is given a number. Okay, remember the 100 students at Pearson College is the population. We've defined that. We can talk about their ages. We can talk about their basic backgrounds in terms of education, how they got in. That would be defining the population. Each student gets a number. Each case within the population gets a number, and then we simply select people at random. So we pick 1, 2, 10, 50, 62. We just pick them at random, and there is actually free software on the internet which will just give you a random number, so you don't just there's no bias creeping in there, and you just it's really quite simple as it's suggested, and random. So you just randomly select a number. Whoever comes out the hat, you go and question them. You do an interview on them. So basically everyone has an equal chance of being selected. It tries to rule out bias, and whoever gets picked is whoever gets surveyed or whoever gets interviewed. So fairly straightforward. Many students use it, really easy. So might be something you want to consider. The next one is stratified random sampling. Now this is a bit more complicated. So what we've got here is we've got a population, and we can divide that population into groups with similar characteristics. So if any of you have done marketing in the past, you've probably heard of segmentation. So what we're doing is dividing people on the same basis. So we might divide people by sex. So we have two groups, male and female. We might divide people by postcode. And we put people or companies in groups based on their postcode. We might do it by age. We might do it by the type of work that a company does. So there's, and again, the way you divide it up is completely up to you. There might be some reason behind it, but what you divide up and how you divide this population up into groups is totally up to you. Now in this one, each group of companies or people is actually called a strata, which makes it a bit more complicated, but it's actually called a strata. Each case within each strata is then given a number. So if you can imagine, you've got these groups, all these different groups, you've got a whole population divided into lots of different groups. Within each group, or they call a group a strata here, we give each case a number, so each person gets a number in each group, and then we select cases at random from each strata. So say we take three cases from each group or each strata. We just take random numbers out, and that's very representative because we are taking a number of people from each different group, so from each different postcode or from each different age group, whatever it is. So it's a bit more complicated, but fairly straightforward, really. But it does guarantee that you have a more representative sample. Uh, the only problem with all of these is that although you've created the sample, um, you and so for example in this one here, you may have a sample that's very representative. It doesn't mean everyone will want to be interviewed. So you may still have dropout, and that's just research. Don't get hung up about it. Don't get upset about it, because that's just research. People will decline your interview, and that messes your sample up. Well, in an ideal world, it would be great that everyone we take from our sample, our stratified random sampling, would actually um, um, be interviewed, but it's not the case, and we just have to write in reasons for what's happening. So, and that's happened to me many times when I've certain companies I wanted to go and research, they've just declined and given reasons for it, and that's just how it is. And you just write that these are the reasons they gave, and that's part of research. It's not a perfect journey. It's a journey with problems, and part of the skill and part of what you're being assessed on is your ability to solve problems and how you got around them. So don't be afraid to do that. Systematic sampling. Now, this involves selecting a sample by choosing every nth in the population disk. So what I mean by this is that imagine you have a population. Again, let's use Pearson College as an example. Say there's 2,000 students this time at Pearson College. Okay, so that's the population. That's all the students we have at the college. And then we want a sample of around about 100 because that's what we think we can realistically achieve in terms of a survey. Okay, so all we do is we give everyone in the population a number. Okay, we list them from 1 to 2,000, and we just choose every 20th student to be included in the sample. Okay, so simple as that, really. It's just choosing every 20th. So again, it's just another way of making sure we're no bias. We're not selecting people that we think will give the results we want. We're just trying to rule out that. And again, it tries to ensure an even spread of where we're taking people, and again, ruling out a fair amount of bias. So that's systematic sampling. Very straightforward. List everyone in the population. Decide on how many people you can realistically research. In this case, it was 100 students. We had a population of 2,000. We've decided that we're going to choose every 20th student on the list that we've got, and the list would probably be in alphabetical order, or it could be in age order. It's completely up to you. There's no real right or wrong there. You can just decide on that. If you want to, if you felt age was particularly important, then list them by age. It could be just by alphabetical, isn't it? There's no real difference there too much. And you choose every 20th here, and those every 20th student in the list would be in the sample, and then you go and send them a survey and get them to complete it in, and that would be systematic sampling. Bit more of a kind of a strategy behind it, really. Now, snowball sampling. Now, this is it's a difficult one because with sampling, what we're trying to do is trying to get a representative sample. We're trying to get to avoid bias. So trying to get a group of people that are fairly representative of the population. Now, sometimes that isn't possible. It's just not possible, and it's sometimes very difficult to identify the people we want to research or the companies we want to research because there's an issue. Now, in this case here with snowball sampling, maybe we want to research people that are working, but they're also being a bit naughty and claiming benefits. Okay, not so good. So they're not going to obviously volunteer themselves to come and answer some surveys and do an interview. So they are difficult people to find, and it would be difficult people to interview. So we tend to use, when we do have that, when we tend to find it difficult for people to come forward to answer questions, we have something called snowball sampling. Now here what we do, we try to make contact with one case in the population, someone who we think is working but also claiming benefits, as it is in this case. And we interview them if they're willing to, or if they're not willing to, we ask them to identify other people that might be doing the same thing, and they might be interested in if they would like to speak to us. Again, with this type of research, people are working and claiming benefits. It is illegal. It is fraud. But it is a worthy research topic because it's an important topic for the taxpayer. So you can justify it that way. Now, the problem is they're not going to be all come rushing to you. And if they do want to talk to you, and you do identify someone through a random sampling method by people referring you on to other people, then you're going to have to put clauses in such as confidentiality. And I'm sure you've seen all these documentaries where they're interviewing someone, but it's an actor's voice and it's it's a blank screen or a shadow. They're sat in a shadow. You can put all that into it. You can make it confidential as much as you want. So in the snowball sampling, we try to make contact with at least one person in the population, which we think would be ideal to interview. We ask them, would they like to be interviewed, or would they like to be questioned about what they're doing. They might decline, but then the next question would be, well, do you know of anyone else who we could speak to? Then you go on and ask them, and then you may ask them to interview, and they say yes, and then you interview them, and then you ask them again, well, is there anyone else who would be willing to speak to us? And they refer you on to someone else. So you can see how it snowballs, because every person you speak to or is willing to speak to you in this case would refer you on to another person, and it's kind of like a snowballing effect. Obviously, problems with making initial contact could be a problem. I've known students that have done work with the police, done research with the police force. Not overly willing to talk about things. The student I was thinking about, great student, was actually researching racism in the police. Now, not many police are going to be talking about racism. So again, it was someone who's willing to talk, and then he used the snowball sampling to talk to someone else, so it snowballed. So it was quite a good one. But it was very problematic to get the initial contact because he kept going around the houses. But again, that's part of research. That's part of the issue. You just need to be persistent and keep going. Um, Again, it may not be representative. That's another limitation. It may not be representative because you're just getting passed on. Who's to say they are representative? It's very difficult. But under the circumstances, we can't do much else because not loads of people are going to come forward. So it's very difficult to get a representative sample. And of course, as I've said, it's used by many undercover documentaries here. Self-selection sampling. Now, this is used quite a lot. Okay, occurs when an individual identifies themselves as a person who wants to, or a company who wants to take part in the research. Now, I've used this myself. So I did my research by action research, and remember that action research is where you actually go and work in a company. You record your decisions. You record the decisions of people around you, your colleagues. You make plans. You implement those plans. You look at the results of those plans. You reflect on the results of those plans, and then from that you make more plans. And it goes around in this cycle of trying to make plans, implement plans, reflect on them, see what happened. Did it work? If not, go back and do another plan. So it's these cycles. Now, I needed a company to do this in, and so I simply put an advert in the paper, and companies phoned me up and said, yeah, we'll be willing to take part. I was doing marketing at the time. It was about improving small companies' marketing, and they let me go and work in there a couple of days a week, and I got the research, and fantastic. I got a master's project out of it. Brilliant. But and drug testing companies use this a lot. So they put an advert in the paper. People come forward who would like to take part in the research. And it's simple as that, really. Or we put a post on Facebook or whatever it may be. We just put it out there, and people come forward to us. It can one of the limitations, again, it's self-selecting. There's bias in there. People will come forward who are willing to take part and maybe have something to say, or very opinionated, and that can skew the results a little bit. But again, you can write about that in your limitations of your research method within your methods section. Most web-based surveys are self-selecting. You go on, they're on the side of the screen. You take part. You don't take part. You choose. The next one is judgmental sampling, and this enables you to use your judgment on selecting cases. Now, this is obviously there's a slight bias in here, but it's actually used quite a lot. So what we're doing here is thinking, right, who would be an ideal person to interview, or who would be an ideal company to go and work in and observe, or who would be an ideal consumer to actually see, talk to. You're very self-selecting on the part of the researcher, and of course there can be bias there because the research could be said to be choosing someone to construct the results in a certain way. However, you've got to be able to justify why you're talking to this type of person or why you're talking to this type of company and suggesting why they're important. Now, this can be divided up actually. Judgmental sampling has various different streams to it. The first one is extreme case sampling. Second one is critical case sampling, and the final one is typical case sampling. Extreme case sampling is where basically we find a person or a company that is basically doing something really, really, really good, extraordinarily good, or extraordinarily disastrous. They're really, 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 really bad, and something really bad's gone wrong. And that's great to look at, and the justification for that is because we want to learn lessons from it. If they're doing really well, you look at the growth of Apple over the last 20 years, amazing growth. Their income is bigger than in some small countries that we have in this world. So amazing case to look at, and amazing lessons to be learned. Of course, we can justify why we're going to want to go and research that. You might be wanting to research a certain person. You might be thinking, well, I want to speak to my local MP. Now, my local MP has been fighting for fracking but I want to understand the reasons why he's doing that, and why he thinks it's so important. Again, a fairly strong case to put forward. So, these extreme case sampling is basically focusing on something that's doing really, really well, outstripping everyone, or something that's hugely disastrous. And we're trying to understand the lessons. But again, justifying why you're focusing on this person or on this company, or whatever it may be. Critical case sampling is similar, okay? And again, it's these. I mean, the terminology is slightly same here, but focused on dramatic cases where lessons can be learned. Critical case. So Blockbuster would be a critical case. HMB would be a critical case. These are companies that are really struggling. They're facing problems in their market. They would be someone we want to look at and understand what's going on, to understand what's going wrong, to make sure that other companies and other managers don't make the same mistakes. And remember that when you're doing research, you're trying to understand what's happening. You're trying to, to make recommendations. And some of the findings might be very useful for tomorrow's managers. It might be very useful for education. Understanding how Apple has grown and the methods they've used and the way they make decisions would be amazing research to help educate managers of tomorrow. But also, so would work at Blockbuster, or HMV or Woolworths, all those companies that have gone by the wayside in the last few years. It'd be interesting to understand what happened and what went wrong. If there's companies that have faced major environmental disasters, what happened there? What was going on? Why did it happen? And what was their thinking at the time? And that's very much like critical case sampling is like air crash investigations. That would be critical case sampling. It's a critical case, critical because a lot of people died, unfortunately. But we need to understand what happened and what went wrong, so we can learn from that and improve what's going on. So that would be a form of critical case sampling. Typical case sampling is somewhere in the middle. These are people that are generally average, or they're companies that have average performance. They're in the middle of the market. They're not the market leader. They're not at the bottom of the market. They've not got poor sales and profits, but they're in the middle and they're average. So people like Ford, people like Vauxhall, average car companies, very popular car companies, but they're not overly profitable compared to some other companies, but they're doing all right, and they're the average. So we'll go and look at them because average is fine. We could maybe learn from companies and people that are just average, and are typical cases, because that would help the people at the bottom of the pile. So typical case sampling is again another method of looking at the typical case within the population. Now, there's quite a lot of sampling there, and there's quite a lot to take in, and you may want to go and do a little bit of reading, but don't worry too much about it. That's my general advice. All you've got to do is dedicate maybe a paragraph or two to this in your major research project, and think about your major submission, I have to say, and think about which sampling method is most appropriate to how you've conducted your research. Was it more convenient sampling? Was it more, or did you go down the road of random sampling? What did you actually do? And state what your sampling method is. Explain how you did it, or what the sampling method, what the procedure is. And if you can, think about reasons why that was the most appropriate. Was it time? Was it fitted? What was the most? Why is it a little bit appropriate? Again, paragraph or two. That's all you really need. So don't get hung up on it. It will take you half an hour, 45 minutes, maybe just to read into these a little bit more. Select the one that's most appropriate or fits well with your work, and a couple of paragraphs or so within your project submission is what it is. So again, not a major issue really. What I would also do though is think about the actual limitations of your sampling method, because that would be useful later on. Many of these research projects, they do like to have some kind of self-critical analysis. So where was your research? Where could it have been improved? Well, if you used convenience sampling, for example, remember that convenience sampling is where people come to you. It's convenient for them to respond. Just say that, well, they're self-selecting. It's quite, there might be some bias there, and that's just a limitation, and that's fine. So just bear in mind those limitations. As long as you're quite upfront about the limitations, it's completely fine. So spend 10 minutes or so now, if you want to, just thinking about the sampling methods we've looked at. You may have already thought about which one you think most appropriate. Make a note of it, and then you can move on to our final part of this recorded session. The last part we're going to look at is case study research, which we've covered briefly before. So I'm not going to labour the point here, but case study research is a form of sampling. You remember that in case study research, we're looking at trying to develop very detailed, very in-depth, very intensive knowledge about basically a single case. Now, when we talk about a case, remember we're talking about a single company, a single person. For example, someone who's doing research on Tony Blair and how he made decisions in the Iraq War would be a case study. Okay, someone who's researching just Blockbuster would be a case study. Now, the definition of case study research does expand to a small number of related cases, but that's very rarely actually seen in practice. Generally, it's one case, one company, one person, and we're focusing on them people. But what we're doing with them is we're looking at them really intently and really in depth because we want to understand the ins and outs of them. So these interviews with a celebrity on TV that goes on for an hour with David Frost or someone, that would be a form of case study research. We are trying to understand how they think. We're trying to understand what they're doing. Case study research, a lot of interview techniques such as in-depth interviews and semi-structured interviews that we've considered in the interview recording in this series of research, generic research lectures. Observational research again lends itself, and action research as well, because action research, remember, you're actually working in a company and you're looking at your own kind of research, own activities, as well as the activities of the company around you. That is case study research because it's very difficult to do that with multiple companies. So if you're focusing on one company or you're focusing on one individual, then my recommendation, you are probably doing case study research. And when you're doing case study research, you're trying to understand that in depth, in and out, the ins and outs of the whole situation. That's the detail here. You're not doing a survey across lots and lots of people to understand a trend. You're actually understanding what this case is about, how they did things, why they did things, and what's it all about. So very detailed, very rich, lends itself very much to in-depth interviews, and we're trying to understand, what's happening and why it's happening and why they made decisions and what they're thinking. So it's really rich information case study research and focusing on just one. The previous stuff we've looked at, extreme case sampling, critical case sampling, and typical case sampling, are also forms of case study research. So this stuff overlaps, and don't be worried about that because the reason why it overlaps is because different authors develop all these different things, and of course there's significant overlap in thinking. So don't worry too much about it. Don't get hung up about it. Choose the one you think that's most appropriate to how you're doing your research. State it and explain how you did it and why it's most appropriate to this sampling method. So again, if you're focusing on one person or you're focusing on one company, that would be a form of a case study. You may also be focusing on one industry or one market, and you're actually looking at one single market, but you're looking at a couple of companies in that market. That again can be classed as case study research. So a small number of cases which are related. They're related because they're in the same market. Okay, so that was sampling, fairly straightforward. Don't get hung up about it, but here's some general advice in what to do in terms of your research method section in your major submission. You need to select a sampling technique. So you need to understand the range of sampling techniques that we've looked at today and think about the one that is most appropriate, always the one you want to go for. Some of you might have been at the late stages of your research and you might be thinking, I didn't really think about sampling. Well, the way you did it, the way you went about it, which sampling technique was closest to? Some of you might have not decided or considered how to choose who you're going to interview or who you're going to survey or how you're going to survey. Then you've got the opportunity now to pick a sampling technique. Again, think about your time constraints, think about the population, think about your research topic, think about which one is going to be quite more appropriate to you and easiest and convenient for you. And that's the key here. So make sure you state clearly what your sampling technique is, explain it and how you actually did it. Demonstrate its use in practice. So in your major submission, in the method section or chapter, show all the cases in the population. Show how you chose every 20th if you're going to do that kind of stratified random sampling. So just explain how it actually worked out. How did you pick out? How does the method actually work? And then if you can, and this I understand this is more difficult, but think about the advantages of using this sampling, think about why you use this sampling, and also think about, more importantly, the limitations of the sampling technique. Remember that the thing with this process is that when you're sampling, you're trying to find a representative sample of the population. Very difficult sometimes, hugely difficult. And some of those techniques are actually forcing you down the road where you aren't getting a representative sample. For example, snowball sampling is not going to get you a representative sample. But you have no option to use no other option to use it because of the nature of the research problem, the research opportunity and issue. You remember in snowballing, I gave an example of trying to research people, interview people that are working, but also fraudulently claiming benefits from the government. They're not going to come forward in a convenient sample. Therefore, snowballing, getting one person and getting them to refer us on to the next one, and snowballing is the most appropriate because it fits with the actual type of the project. It fits with the context of the project. So, um, you know, very important that we consider that, and you consider the nature of your project, but also the limitations, that there will be biases, there could be biases leaking in. Just be aware of that, and strike them up. Don't hide them, because that's going to be beneficial to anyone. So dead easy, state your sampling technique, demonstrate its use in practice. So tell what was the procedure you used. Was it every 20th? How did you divide the groups up as the procedures are described in this lecture, or as in the textbook? And then justify and provide the limitations to this sampling technique. And again, this is going to be a couple of paragraphs in a major submission, even at level 6. So don't be too afraid about this. Just do a little bit of reading, and decide on a sampling technique. Well, I hope that's been useful. A whirlwind tour of sampling. Not the most overly interesting topic, I agree, but it's not too onerous. It does take a little bit of time reading about these sampling techniques, going through the procedure, stating which sampling technique you used, and also showing how you did it in practice, and then striking up any limitations, or why you chose this sampling technique, why it was the most appropriate in comparison to your topic. So relatively straightforward, but does need to be taken account if you are going for those higher level marks. So I hope it's been useful. Again, any good research methods textbook for business students would give you information on a whole range of sampling techniques, and there is a list as long as my arm. I've given you a fairly heavy list, which are probably some of the most popular, but there are others. So I do recommend that you spend maybe an hour just reading about sampling, so you settle your mind on where you're going and what you're going to be selecting. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope it was useful. Thank you.